Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Our survival special, Hurricane Survival Special, continues now online on WKRG.com. And I know we've got viewers on Facebook, and you can see we've got our entire team of meteorologists joining us. John Nodar, Caroline Carithers, Thomas Giboy, and also Colleen Peterson. We've also got Ross Whitley from our sister station, WMBB in Panama City, watching us as well. Also, we've got Zachary Hood from the Baldwin County Emergency Management Office. And we're going to talk with our team and panel of experts and answer your questions. Make sure you send us questions on our website or also on Facebook throughout the evening. Our meteorologists will be monitoring your questions and we'll be answering them over the next couple of minutes. Let's go ahead and begin with the season forecast. A lot of folks want to see this, and we've been talking about this over the last couple of weeks. Earlier this year, actually within the last couple of months, we did get some new information from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration as well as Colorado State University. Now, on a normal year, you would expect 12 named storms in the Atlantic, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Last year was a more active season. We had 18 named storms. But now you look at the forecast from Colorado State University predicting 16 named storms, 8 of those becoming hurricanes and 4 of those becoming major hurricanes. And NOAA is in the same range with 13 to 19 named storms and 6 to 10 hurricanes. Again, we always mention that just because you're talking about a more active season doesn't necessarily equate to landfall. So what we'd like to see is all the storms that form stay out to sea, but that's certainly something we'll have to watch. Well, as we mentioned at the top of our special today, is that this is a very unusual time, as this is a hurricane season in the midst of a global pandemic. And meteorologist John Nodar spoke with the folks there at the Baldwin County Emergency Management. And John, you know, going through this, you've covered many hurricane seasons here on the Gulf Coast. This one, in the midst of this kind of situation that we're in, could be very, very challenging.
All right, so you are exactly right. It is going to be a difficult time trying to figure out this new way of dealing with one another and with hurricane season because of COVID-19. And Zach, I sure appreciate all the help you gave us with the hurricane special and the information you provided there. But for folks that are just joining us, the main point I think that you were making is it's got to be your last resort to go to a shelter. You should have other plans set up ahead of that.
John, you're absolutely right. You know, what we want to say this year is a shelter should not be anyone's first option. In fact, if you will plan now, chances for you to be able to go ahead and secure those plans, lock those plans in, certainly would be the best for not only you, but for officials in Baldwin County.
All right. And as we mentioned during the hurricane special, Baldwin County shelters are going to be at about a quarter capacity.
Absolutely. There are best practices and guidance that was sent to us from CDC, FEMA. We've also worked with your private nonprofit organizations that really we depend on to help with shelters, and they're seeing the same thing we are, and it is you have to have distance. We have to be able to screen individuals when they show up to check in a shelter, and then we also have to be able to distance. But I will tell you this, when it comes to it, and we're within that 12-hour mark of a storm making landfall in a community, we're going to have to help those that are in imminent danger, that are in immediate threat, and that's what a shelter's for. We want to save a life now, and so the best thing to do is go ahead and lock a plan in, so that way you do not have to be concerned on whether you have to shelter in a congregate shelter, meaning with others that you may or may not know.
All right, and that could be a situation where you're going to be a lot closer to people than you want to be. The idea of evacuating, who generally is going to evacuate?
Yeah,
a lot of folks can stay where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I want to encourage is that you, wherever you are, whoever may be watching this, that they identify where their home address is, or maybe where it is they go on vacation. You would not believe the amount of individuals that do not understand how the zones work in relationship to where they are. But what I do want to encourage, John, back to your question, is once you identify your evacuation zone, don't question whether you should evacuate or not. If your zone is in and called for the evacuation during any given period, that's not the time to guess and decide whether you need to stay or not. That is, let's go, time to go, let's get out of here, let's save ourselves, let's go to where we'll have power, let's go to where we will have water, and when this is clear and passes, we will move in and we'll clean up and we will recover.
All right, I'm going to hand it off to the others
Yeah.
second, but I have one more question for you, Zach. We've talked a lot about shelters, but are there other ways that COVID-19 is affecting the emergency response to hurricanes?
Oh, the shelter has been certainly consuming most of our time. But what you will also see is COVID-19 is just about linked to anything that we do. And you have to think about, are there medical supplies available? How do we screen? If you look at the Emergency Operations Center, it is the hub. It's where your first response leaders come. And we have to be able to screen at our door prior to entry to the Emergency Operations Center, because the individuals that are responsible for response and recovery, if we become ill and contaminate those around us, you get into a very limited depth chart, if you will. So everything from planning internally and externally, I always like to say, look, we're not doing anything that we have not asked you to do. We're doing the same things here internally. We will continue to do those things as COVID-19 and tropical storm season progresses.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Zach, for joining us here for the last couple minutes. It's passing along some great information that folks need to be aware of. So, Zach, thank you so much. Really quickly, I want to show you a couple of interesting tidbits that we did compile for you folks here. This is a look at the strongest hurricanes to ever make landfall. And actually, the strongest hurricane ever, this includes the Pacific Basin as well, Hurricane Patricia, not too long ago, back in 2015, that had maximum sustained winds of 210 miles per hour. The reason I bring this up is the most recent Category 5 hurricane to make landfall in the U.S., as we know, it was only 2 years ago with Hurricane Michael. So I want to bring in our chief meteorologist, Ross Whitley from WMBB in Panama City. And Ross, I thank you so much for taking a little bit of time to speak with us, because we saw your story and sort of going through the hour by hour of how this storm impacted you folks there in Panama City. But I want to ask you, just from someone, not many meteorologists can say they've covered a Category 5 hurricane. Tell me a little bit about your experience and what it was like at the station at the time. All right, looks like we're having some technical difficulties there with Ross, but we'll try to get back to him to talk about that. But let's talk again about this year, which is in fact a significant year, the 15-year anniversary since Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. Hard to believe that it's been 15 years since that event. Meteorologist Thomas Gieboy put together our story about Hurricane Katrina, its impacts on the Mississippi coast. Now, Thomas, you're a Mississippi native, and so you were around this area when Hurricane Katrina made its landfall. Of course, a record-breaking storm in terms of not just the rain, of course, the unfortunate casualties, but also about the storm surge. Talk a little bit about what you remember from Katrina.
Well, the thing is, I'm a Mississippi native. I'm a Mississippi Gulf Coast native, but if anyone knows me really well, we actually moved to the Mississippi Gulf Coast in 2005. So I've spent most of my life along the Gulf Coast. So been familiar with hurricanes. My grandmother's from Baldwin County, and just going through the whole experience leading up to it. I mean, we didn't even evacuate for the storm until 2 days before Katrina was moving through. And John and I talk about it all the time, but whenever Katrina was moving back into the Gulf of Mexico, just how quickly it intensified, I think that caught everybody off guard. And then you just see this massive hurricane that becomes a Category 5. I mean, typically it's uncommon to see Category 5s, but to see them that large was something very appalling, but it wasn't the wind speed that was so memorable when it comes to Hurricane Katrina. So the category, I think, doesn't really matter. It was a Category 3 at landfall, but just the size of it and just all the wind-driven water, just seeing how high some of the water got up. I was one of the fortunate ones. My neighborhood, every single house in the neighborhood flooded except for ours. We got water in the garage, but our house is about 20 feet above sea level, and we're still plenty far away from the center of circulation in Ocean Springs. And I'm talking about on the far eastern side of Ocean Springs, the farther away you get from it. And in my piece, I talked about how there was storm surge of around 20 feet all the way to the Mississippi-Alabama line. And if anyone's on Mobile Bay, Bayou Battery, it's hard to get those images of just how high the water was with Hurricane Katrina. And I just remember seeing the water lines, just how high some of the water got up. I mean, houses that were on stilts were completely washed away, and you could see those water lines on the bridges, and it's hard to imagine just how the water could have gotten that high.
Absolutely incredible there. And you remember, you of course for our special also did a little explainer, kind of talking a little bit more about the fact that water is such a significant impact with these storms, not only with the storm surge, but of course inland flooding, as we learned with Hurricane Harvey, which affected Texas back in 2017, dropping in some cases nearly 60 inches of rain, incredible amounts. Let's see if we can go to the piece that Thomas put together, talk a little bit more about storm surge.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about storm surge. Now, what is storm surge? All you need to think of it is as just water being pushed by the winds towards the shore and by strong winds. This isn't directly related to the storm's category. It's influenced by many things like storm intensity, forward speed, the size of the storm, the angle of approach, and also the shape of the coastline, along with other things. You might not think of it, but storm surge is the deadliest aspect of hurricanes statistically, so when you pile them all together, storm surge is traditionally the dangerous part of any hurricane. Moderate storm surge can be even brought on by a tropical storm. This means flooding near the coastline is likely, can be enhanced by tides known as storm tides, and coastal erosion is likely along with dangerous surf. For perspective, 1 cubic yard or 200 gallons of water is equal to 1,700 pounds. We are talking about a seriously high amount of force. High storm surge will bring devastating impacts like the loss of life and property. Extensive damage to infrastructure like roads and power systems likely as well, and this can drastically change the coastline and the surrounding ecosystem. And during high storm surge, it can actually extend several miles inland as well. Here are a list of some notable storm surges from hurricanes in the past, and if you want to find more information about these storms, you can head over to WKRG.com.
Back here with our crew monitoring this, I want to go back to Ross Whitley from our sister station WMBB in Panama City. Got the signal working again. So Ross, thanks for joining us for a couple minutes. Again, just the most recent Category 5 to strike the U.S. happened in your neck of the woods with Hurricane Michael. Tell us a little bit about what you experienced covering a Category 5 hurricane, because it's very rare that folks in our industry are around to cover that kind of storm.
Yeah, it's something that you won't ever forget when you do go through it. It's definitely going to leave a lasting mark on our area. And it was something that, quite honestly, you can't prepare for. So a storm of that magnitude and that type of storm, it is a reason that it's historic, that there's only been 4 of them. Because the devastation that is caused by a Category 5 is the definition of catastrophic. And I know we've seen some devastating storms in the past that haven't necessarily had to have been a Category 5 type of storm. But if there's ever a storm that fits the SAFFIR-SIMPSON scales as far as its definition goes, I would point to Hurricane Michael.
And I remember I've actually visited the area about 6 months after the storm hit, and I remember just walking around downtown Panama City and in other parts, especially as you head down towards Mexico Beach, and some areas it started to look like there was a good amount of recovery, but other areas looked like the day they did after the storm. Talk to me a little bit about the recovery process. Does folks who visit Panama City now, what can they expect? Is there still a lot of visible damage in the area? Okay. All right, looks like Ross's feet is frozen a little bit, but we're still looking at some video from Hurricane Michael from what was covered there. And again, actually I visited the folks there at WMBB, and I remember seeing what the damage was. Ross, it looks like is back. If Ross can hear me, talk a little bit about what Panama City looks like now. How has the recovery process been?
Yeah, it's a slow process. It's definitely not something that happens overnight. And I love when I hear people say, well, you know, it's been a couple of years, you're back to normal. And the truth and reality is that that's just not going to be the case. It's not going to be the case for a while. It's going to be the scar that's left here will be here for probably 10 or 15 years. As far as our economic recovery and businesses and things like that, we're back on track. And the pandemic certainly doesn't help with having to close things down, but we are starting to see our businesses return and the flow of day-to-day life is back to normal. But as far as the landscape goes and even people rebuilding their houses,
Yeah, so unfortunately, we're seeing Ross's signal going in and out. But again, things are slowly improving. But as Ross mentioned, with a storm of that magnitude, it just takes forever. In fact, there'll be scars that go on for decades after the storm exits. So we want to thank Ross Whitley from WMBB for giving us his perspective covering such significant storms. And also, we want to bring in Caroline Carithers, because Caroline, word has it that, of course, that your folks in your area, and actually some of your family members, did get impacted by Michael as it came ashore. And you've been reporting on here, but talk a little bit about what it was like, because I know you were here on the Gulf Coast when Michael was threatening.
Yes, actually, I was heading down to Florida because it was our spring break, and I went to bed and it was a Category 2, and I woke up and it was a Category 4. And so I remember calling and texting my husband's family immediately, because they live in Lynn Haven and Panama City. And they actually evacuated last minute to Mobile, and they got back, and my husband's grandmother lost her home, and it was just like a third of it was just demolished. And as well as his aunt's house was really damaged, and it just took so long for insurance and all of the logistics to really work out that their home was just like finished. So it's definitely taken a long time to rebuild, just because of the sheer magnitude of all of that damage. But I went down lots of different times. We went down kind of maybe a month after it happened, and then like you did, Ed, like 6 months later. And it was just crazy to see the amount of damage and kind of the long lasting effects there as well.
And one thing that I remember when we were watching this is how thankful we were about the information that was coming in from hurricane hunters. Of course, we live not too far away, Keesler Air Force Base here, where the hurricane hunters do take flight from. They also take flight from many parts of the Gulf Coast. And Caroline, I do, of course, you've done several stories with the folks there from the hurricane hunters, and you're talking a little bit about the preparation, knowing, you know, is it going to be a below average season or above average season? What did they tell you in terms of how they prepare based off of seasonal forecasts?
So they told me it doesn't really change how they prepare. They said they prepare for the maximum that they can do, which is 3 storms in 3 different locations. So they said it doesn't really matter to us. Of course, we look at the NOAA forecast and we look at all of the different forecasts just so we can mentally prepare. But he said, as far as preparing scheduling wise and all of that, it doesn't really matter if it's going to be an active season or not. They're going to prepare for the worst and hope for the best, like we all do. And he also said that during coronavirus, it's changed the way they train. They only are training on base like necessary trainings, and they've started to bring in more as we get closer to hurricane season. And of course, they do a lot of backups with scheduling. They have a lot of people on standby just in case something were to happen. So they're adapting to coronavirus as well. But as far as an active season or not active season forecast, they don't really, he told me, don't prepare any differently.
And I also want to bring Colleen into this conversation as well, because Colleen Peterson has also done some reporting with the folks at the Hurricane Hunters. But last year, last year we were watching Hurricane Dorian. That was the big storm, as we remember, the incredible impact that it had on the Bahamas. And Colleen, I know you were down in Florida at the time of Dorian as it was starting to make its approach. and talk a little bit about what it was like, just sort of waiting on pins and needles as Dorian was inching closer and closer to the east coast of Florida.
Yeah, and Hurricane Dorian, it was an interesting storm. I mean, 3 days out from the forecast of Dorian inching close to the coast of Florida, it was looking like it was going to impact Florida. But we all know it slowed down to about 1 mile per hour just outside of Bahamas, which actually made the storm demolish Bahamas. I mean, it was a very traumatic event for the Bahamians. And you can see that it only skirted along the coast of Florida. I was in Cocoa Beach. We only got wind gusts up to maybe 35, 40 miles per hour, but we didn't really get much storm surge. But with hurricanes of that magnitude, that close to the coast, we all really do need to be prepared. And observational data from the hurricane hunters is what really defines hurricane forecasting. Those initial observations really help make the models more precise and giving you guys an accurate forecast. So when the hurricane hunters makes their rounds through the eye of the storm, it gets feeded into the models and helps make a more clearly defined forecast. But yeah, Hurricane Dorian, it was a nasty storm. Didn't really get a lot of effects besides a few waves and gusty conditions, but not a lot of damage here. But we all know the Bahamas is still recovering from that storm.
No doubt. And I want to remind folks who are watching on our Facebook page to actually submit your questions, and we're going to try to answer some of those. But just to sort of end at least our main presentation here, I want to talk a little bit, of course, about what you need to do to prepare. We've got our entire First Alert Storm team up right now, and I'm going to go to each of you guys. John, of course, we've covered many of these in the past, and folks who've lived on the Gulf Coast for many years, this is sort of commonplace. But for some folks who are brand new to the area, we know we have seen some growth, especially in the Florida Panhandle, and for folks who have never been through a storm, through one of these events. Talk a little bit about some of the basics that folks need to have when it comes to their disaster supply kits.
All right. Yeah, that's a good one, because one of the things you've got to realize, and really was driven home during Katrina, is that you've got to be able to support yourself and your family for at least 3 days on your own. You have to imagine that no help will get to you for 3 days. So what you have to have is water and food and all the necessities to get through 3 days if you are able to stay in your home. So that's a big deal. If you are leaving your home, if you're evacuating your home, then you have to have a kit, and you have to have medicines. You have to have your important papers. The papers should be in a waterproof, like Ziploc bags, and maybe inside something else that's waterproof, because these are things like your Social Security card and your birth certificates, any of those really vital papers, passports, things like that. So all of that is that's just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, we have our WKRG hurricane guide that will give you a checklist of stuff like that. But the main thing that I would drive home the fact is that you need to have a supply kit you through 3 days, and don't wait. It's tempting to wait. Yeah. There's at least a storm in the Gulf, but don't just jump in there. Go ahead and why not get your canned sardines now instead of later? Why wait? Go ahead and pick up what you need early on. Be ready when the warnings are eventually will be.
Yeah, I would say even a can of sardines seasoned the right way can still get you through some hard times, no doubt about that. But also, Thomas, let's talk a little bit about some of the lesser known things. John mentioned it when it comes to folks being prepared. We live and die, unfortunately, by our cell phones nowadays, but this is something that can become, in some cases, useless after a storm of the magnitude of a Michael or a Katrina moves through. So you need to have a different option other than your phone.
Yeah, you sure do. I mean, and just of the importance of a cell phone, I mean, I'm using one right now for this very purpose. And I'm sure everybody, if you don't leave your house with your phone, you feel like a part of you is missing. You're searching wherever you need to go high and low and trying to find out where that phone is. But it's important to make sure that you have multiple ways that you can get not only just warning information, but information in general. And we had it in the hurricane special, but one of the old school ways of getting information is a weather radio, because those frequencies can still be transmitted even if the power grid goes down. I think Hurricane Michael is a great example of what can happen, because the infrastructure was completely wiped out. And if the infrastructure is wiped out, even if you have a charge on your phone, you're probably not going to be able to use it. And it might be a good idea, if you still have cell service, to have maybe a backup thing to have that you can plug it into, that maybe gives you a couple of extra charges just in case. That way you can get in contact with loved ones. That way you can get in contact with emergency officials if, God forbid, that's what eventually happens. But you need to have more than one way to get notified, and you have to have a plan to get through a storm, knowing that you might not have the lifeline of your phone. So that's why it's very essential to make sure that you have that plan.
Absolutely. And now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the viewer questions that folks are sending us on our social media. Colleen Peterson joins us now and has actually our first viewer question. So Colleen, what do you got today?
All right. David Carpenter says, can you speculate how different the coverage and the outcome would have been if you had the tools to cover that, if you have it now in 2020? So they're just talking about past storms, like from Camille, like back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. How has technology changed over time when it comes to forecasting hurricanes?
Well, and technology has come very, very far away. I mean, I remember back in '04 living on the west coast of Florida when Hurricane Charlie was threatening us. And I do remember, and I think, John, if you can chime in on this, because you've seen the advancements of technology. Every year, that sort of cone of uncertainty, sort of that yellow threat cone, the forecasting gets much, much better when it comes to these storms. But even you think back 15 years ago, some of the technology that we have now, maybe having that kind of technology during Katrina, I think maybe some of the exact impacts could have been a little bit better. But I want you to weigh in on this. What do you think about that? All right, John, if you can hear me, it looks like your line
is that better?
There you go. We got you there. So talk a little bit about more about how the technology has come so far along.
All right, and yeah, I would go back to Katrina and say that perhaps we would have had a better indication that that storm was going to blow up so quickly over the Gulf Loop current. So, and I don't know that that is necessarily a factor of technology versus a factor of experience. We learn so much with every storm. With Ivan, we started seeing the idea of eye wall replacement, which has come into forecasting in a big way since. Every storm teaches us something, and as we learn more, the technology improves on top of that. And as you point out, what that means is a better forecast every time. We have a forecast cone that used to cover the same. If we had the exact same storm in the Gulf, the forecast cone at one time would have covered everything from about Tallahassee to New Orleans, and that cone would be maybe a few counties wide. I mean, that's a huge difference. Maybe a couple of 100 miles at the most. So the forecasting has gotten incredibly better. Yeah. The models have gotten so much better. The radar has gotten so much better. Yeah. I go back to the old radar, even pre-Doppler. Boy, am I a dinosaur? But the technology and top of the technology, the skill and the knowledge that comes with each storm has really improved forecasting.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about that. I want to show you, folks, the SAFFIR-SIMPSON scale. This is the scale that we all know living here on the Gulf Coast. This is nothing unusual, but the SAFFIR-SIMPSON scale is, is our base in terms of categorizing storms by wind. Let me go ahead and put that back up here, and I'll throw in a couple of extra graphics, which we're going to kind of talk about here in just a couple of minutes. But I want Caroline to weigh in on this scale, because a lot of folks, I think, will, unfortunately, we've seen even in recent years, will make their preparations or their decisions in terms of a storm's impact based off this scale and this scale alone. We saw that in the Carolinas with Hurricane Florence a couple of years ago. That storm weekend, it was expected to be a Cat 4. It came ashore as a Category 1. But we always want to point out that evacuating or deciding what your plan should be should not solely be based on this, because this is purely a wind scale. Talk a little bit about that, Caroline.
Yes, so I actually just recently did a story with the National Weather Service. They were talking about storm surge, and they said, storm surge is kind of overlooked sometimes, not all the time, but just sometimes, because people focus so much on that wind scale, and they focus really just on the category sometimes. And they were saying, because storm surge isn't directly related to the actual category of that storm, people kind of tend to overlook it and kind of brush it under the rug, when storm surge is just kind of dependent on a lot of different things. So it's dependent on the angle at which the storm hits the coastline. It's dependent on how the coastline is formed. It's dependent on the size, the speed, the shape. So it's dependent on so many, but it is the #1 killer in tropical cyclones. So while that wind scale is important, and it's something that we should definitely communicate still, and it's something that we should definitely talk about and stay informed upon, there are other kind of effects and things that are dependent on other parts of the storm other than the wind speed, like the size, like the shape, like the speed, like that kind of thing. So it's definitely something to take into account when preparing, but also look at the whole picture, other than just the wind speed.
Yeah, these are very complex storms, and we're going to go ahead and end with our team. I want to thank meteorologist John Nodar, meteorologist Colleen Peterson, Thomas Gieboy, and Caroline Carithers for joining us for this digital extra for our Hurricane Survival Special. Right now, I do want to talk a little bit about what's happening right now, because the tropics are extremely active. We've already had 2 preseason named storms, and if you are not able to join us for our earlier broadcast, this is a look at the current situation with the newly formed Tropical Depression number 3. This formed at 4 o'clock this afternoon. This is the 7 p.m. advisory. Area of circulation sitting just off of the west coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, just off of Campeche, Mexico. Winds are still at 50 miles per hour, but the track of this storm is very interesting. Over the next couple of days, it's just going to sort of meander over the Bay of Campeche. I know the words are getting a little bit mixed up, but this is expected by tomorrow to become Tropical Storm Cristobal. That's the 3rd named storm of the season. And then it's just going to sort of meander over the Bay of Campeche, and then it starts to move off to the north and east. That will happen later this week and early into the weekend. Now, I want you to note with the positioning here at 1 p.m. on Saturday, the cone of uncertainty is very large with this. There is still a lot up in the air in terms of exactly how strong this is going to be and exactly where this is going to be. How much does this get impacted by land? Does the center stay right over the peninsula? It's possible that that happens here. A lot of the forecast models are showing this general northern trajectory by the time we get into the weekend. And I know a lot of folks are kind of wondering, how is this going to impact on the Gulf Coast? Exactly what impacts. The one thing that we are sure of is when you get a storm to move into the central Gulf, it's going to start kicking up the wave activity. Waves could be on the order of 5 to 6 feet near our coast by the time we hit the weekend. Also, a very high risk of rip currents can be expected. But in terms of the exact rain impacts, the exact wind impacts in our area, there is still a lot up in the air. We're still working to fine tune, and hopefully once hurricane hunters fly into this system, which they are expected to do so tomorrow, we should have a better idea, and once the forecast model should start to come into a better agreement exactly where this goes. So we're going to keep a very close eye on this, and we're going to have the latest update, which we'll get a new update coming up tonight on News 5 at 10 here on WKRG. We'll also have another update on the Gulf Coast CW at 9 o'clock. For meteorologist Meteorologist John Nodar, Thomas Gieboy, Colleen Peterson, and Caroline Carruthers. I'm Chief Meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth. Thank you so much for joining us for our web special, and stay safe this hurricane season.